Thank you very much, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think that along perhaps with the release of Nelson Mandela, the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's two events where I think life-changing moments for my generation, wherever we were in the world, when they were happening. And to be here 20 years on and able to contribute to these discussions is a particular honour and a pleasure. In 1989 I was still a school teacher. I was teaching maths in a deprived community in Scotland and in the early stages of elected politics. And thinking about that as I was coming over from Scotland this morning reminded me of perhaps just about the funniest thing that happened to me when I was First Minister of Scotland. It happened in a school shortly before the election in 2007. And we were opening a brand new school on the outskirts of the city of Glasgow. And as ever on these occasions, the school looked absolutely perfect. The pupils, the students, the teachers, the parents who were there for the day, the other members of staff were all looking at their very best. The speeches had gone well, there was some music, and the new school looked like a fantastic building that was going to be a great resource for the community. And I thought this must be just about the most perfect school in Scotland. But as a former teacher, I should have known better. And after the ceremony was finished, I went to the head teacher's room to do a radio interview, much like I think I'm going to do after this speech today. And outside the head teacher's room, I don't know if this is the case in every country represented in this room, but certainly in Scotland this is almost always true. There is one little boy sitting outside the head teacher's room on a seat, waiting for the head teacher to return. And I couldn't resist, as a former school teacher, stopping to talk to him. And perhaps, if I'm being honest, showing off a little to those who were with me. And I stopped and said, "Why are you sitting there?" And he mumbled something into his chest, which I couldn't quite hear. So I pressed the point and said, "Have you been in trouble today?" And he said, "Yes, I'm very sorry. I have been in trouble this morning, very sorry." And I thought, right, I am not a school teacher anymore. I am the First Minister of Scotland. What can I say that might have an impact on his behaviour for the rest of the day? Without really thinking through what might happen next, I said, "Do you realise that I am in charge of all of the prisons in Scotland?" And this little boy had a flicker of recognition and friendship in his eye as he looked up to me and said, "You will have met my big brother then." I just hope he didn't follow in his big brother's footsteps. Today I want to talk as briefly as possible, to give a chance for questions and answers, about the importance of conflict in the widest sense, the importance of conflict prevention, but in particular about stabilisation and peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. I'll talk probably primarily about Africa, because that is where I am most engaged at the moment. But I think much of what I have to say has a much wider relevance than that. It's clear that 20 years ago, this weekend, an entire world order changed and lives were changed. I don't believe they were just changed in Eastern Europe, or even for that matter across Europe, as the European Union then expanded and new friendships were developed that I think benefited the whole continent. I'm absolutely certain that the events here 20 years ago that weekend have led on to many of the improvements in the quality of life for people who live, for example, in the Republic of China or in Latin America, or for that matter in Africa. It's perhaps a salient point that the first elected leader in Africa to give up office, having lost an election voluntarily, was in Benin in 1991, only 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Up until that point, in 30 or so years of independence for most African states, elected leaders had not voluntarily lost elections and given up office. And I think the mood for democracy and change that, in many ways, on our television screens at least, was personified by what happened this weekend in Berlin 20 years ago, had an impact, obviously, far, far beyond Europe. But it also unleashed a world that was more uncertain, because the world order had changed. And we saw, obviously, in the 1990s, genocide in Africa and in Europe. We saw civil wars and tensions erupt across the globe that perhaps had been contained in the past by the great divide between the two power blocs that dominated the world order before 1989. And I think it seems to me, perhaps, that it might have been inconceivable back in 1989 that 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we would still be in a situation where there are across the world today something like 26 million people internally displaced within their own countries as a result of conflict. There are something like 300,000 child soldiers, many of them forcibly recruited into armies or into situations that I think most of us couldn't really imagine in our lives, where hundreds of thousands of women still face rape and assault of other forms as a result of either civil war conflicts or guerrilla conflicts or cross-border conflicts throughout the world. And where each country that is involved in a war or a conflict loses not just something like about $50 million US, but also loses something like 20 years in development. And I think those statistics show perhaps, beyond of course the death and the destruction that goes along with conflict, the impact on individuals and on people and communities and on countries of conflicts which I think perhaps 20 years ago we might not have anticipated would still be happening to the same extent. The other thing the thing that has particularly changed, though, I think, over that 20 years is that the nature of conflicts has moved on. No longer are most conflicts about either movement of borders, the capture of land from a state on the other side of your existing border, or, for that matter, about the power blocs that then dominated the world. But more and more conflicts today are about religion, ethnic divides, about power within a country, between individuals who seek that power, or old tensions that have perhaps been released. And in those situations, it is clear that peace agreements, which may in the past have been easier described as victories for one side over the other, but peace agreements perhaps in the modern world, peace agreements are not enough to sustain peace and to resolve those conflicts. We need to also deal with the causes of the conflicts as well, and that makes reconstruction and development in a post-conflict situation absolutely vital. It also makes, and this is, supposes my central point here this evening, conversely, it makes, for me at least, conflict prevention and the building of sustainable peace by far the greatest and the toughest development challenge of these early years of the 21st century. On the positive side, I think there are signals that can give us some real hope. First of all, I think the continued existence of, and success of the European Union, for all its imperfections, and the role that it increasingly plays throughout the world, I think is a positive. I think the relative peace and increasing integration and outward approach of much of Southern and Latin America, I think is a positive that certainly was not there in the days of the Cold War. Clearly, the election of a new administration in the United States, which is in principle, and I think already in practice, multilateral in its approach, under not just President Obama, but the people he has appointed around him, at least has the potential to be the first genuinely multilateral American administration, I think, in my lifetime. And fourthly, I think the changes in Africa, moving on from the old Organisation of African Unity to the new African Union, an organisation that has a much more proactive role in helping the continent and its individual nations succeed. I think that is a fundamental change that signals how things could work more successfully in the 21st century. Indeed, already we see, for example, across Africa, the number of state-based and in other words, state-to-state conflicts, or non-state, in other words, civil war type conflicts in Africa, reduced by about 50% between 1999 and 2006. And the number of fatalities from conflict in Africa dropped by about 2/3 between 2002 and 2006. And I think that's not in no small part due to the way in which African leaderships, both collectively and individually, have responded to some of the disasters of the 1990s. But still within that context, there is the huge threat, I think, of fragile states. Over 1 billion people in the world live in weak or fragile states. The number of individual weak states in the world far outnumbers the number of strong, stable states. Something like half of the world's poorest people live in states that are fragile in nature. Something like half the world's child and maternal deaths take place or occur in states that are defined as fragile. And if you add into that the likely failure for many countries to reach the Millennium Development Goals, the impact of the current financial crisis on international aid and development, the impact of energy challenges and climate change on those fragile states in particular, but the developing world as a whole, and the impact of technological change, which will increasingly allow individuals or very small groups of people to wreak havoc when they want to, rather than need large numbers of people involved in individual conflicts or destructive actions. When you add those factors in, then I think the world, while there is hope, there are also still great threats to peace and security for the whole world, but obviously particularly in those fragile states. And I think, I believe very, very strongly that in an increasingly interdependent and interconnected world, it is the responsibility of all of us, particularly I think here in Europe, given our colonial history, but elsewhere in the world, to the responsibility of all of us to develop stable and successful states out of those states that would currently be defined as fragile and potentially unstable. The final point about context that I would want to make is about peacekeeping. There are, many of you will know this already if you're studying international relations, but there are at the moment 18 peacekeeping missions under the auspices of the United Nations in the world. There are 116,000 personnel committed to those missions, the largest of which is in the DRC, about 20,000 people serving the Monarch mission there. The total annual cost of those missions for last year was just over $7 billion US. And I have to say that I don't think that is sustainable. And while I suspect that's probably a view that's held across not just individuals but countries the world over, that is not sustainable, there seems to me to be a lack of urgency in dealing with the scale of that situation and the need to find an alternative way of not just keeping the peace but building the peace in a sustainable way. Which brings me to peace building, and I hope we might spark off a bit of discussion this evening on this. Two things in advance. First, the whole approach to conflict needs to change. I know that it is changing in some of the conflicts that exist and perhaps dominate our news media today, but the whole approach to conflict, to mix the military intervention with civilian development interventions in a far more integrated fashion, that seems to me to be a basic change that needs to happen with more urgency and with more commitment, particularly on the part of those who, in the developed world, who contribute most to some of the largest conflicts in the world. But secondly, also prevention has to be better than responding to conflicts that have already erupted or to managing the peace. And in relation to prevention, it seems to me that the role of mediation, the role of early warning systems as part of a global approach, the management of natural resources in a transparent and equitable manner, and having as much of those three things done at the regional level or the continental level rather than the global level would seem to me to be prerequisites of building more sustainable peace in more parts of the world. But I do think that the world can do so much better in relation to supporting countries that are coming out of conflict and want to build a sustainable peace. There are countless examples, and this year alone, I think I have now visited 12 different countries that might be described in some way as post-conflict. And each and every one of them, I found international agencies who talk a good game, but do not cooperate together behind one strategy. I found delays in finance and personnel that held up vital projects and created disillusionment and increased tension on the ground. I and I'm sure others in this room will have seen this before, I've seen egos come in front of sensible decision making and working together. And I think there are really big changes required in the international response to post-conflict reconstruction. We need to build strong institutions in countries that are coming out of conflict. And that means both strong civic institutions as well as strong government, elected democratic government institutions. It means strong institutions for the delivery of services and rights for people, as well as important neutral institutions for the delivery of justice in post-conflict countries. Only by doing that will we improve the current situation where something like a third of conflicts that come to an end with a peace agreement re-emerge into conflict again within 5 years. I think there are 5 key elements of this. The first is to make sure that we can help create and develop independent, trusted and well-trained justice and security services. The second, and I think this is overlooked on too many occasions, the second would be to ensure that we provide the advice and support that might help create successful taxation, revenue and customs organisations and systems. The third would be to support economic development, particularly early, rapid economic development, so that there is a jobs dividend, an immediate dividend for people in the peace, which would stop them being tempted perhaps to go back into conflict. The fourth would be to support elections, strong parliaments that operate democratically and transparently, and I think increasingly in strong local government, elected local government too. And the fifth, and of course absolutely vital element in all of this, improved public services, particularly in education, but also in health and clean water and the other essentials of life. In each of these areas, the international community currently has a variety of organisations and agencies with responsibility, in addition to the NGOs and donor countries who make their contribution as well. And if you go into any of the post-conflict countries, particularly in Africa, and ask people direct questions, for example, in one country in sub-Saharan Africa this year, where I had the head of the World Bank in the country and the head of the United Nations in the country around the same lunch table, and asked them if I was the president of that country and wanted to improve the coordinated response by all the agencies, which of them I would phone first as the most senior and the person in charge, and they both almost left the table because they didn't even want to look at the question, never mind hear the question, never mind try and answer it. The response of those international agencies lets people down again and again and again. And example after example of international agencies supporting, on the one hand, capacity building projects in public financial management, and then paying other people to come in from other countries to monitor their projects in country rather than support the development of the capacity for public financial management in that country itself. So in all of these different areas, I think the global response is not yet good enough and could be an awful lot better. And I think that needs 4 things, but they all require, I think, a stronger global leadership on this. There's an interesting debate taking place in Europe just now about whether we have a strong leader for the European Council or someone who would take more of a back seat and coordinate the strong national leaders. That debate doesn't seem to me to take place on the global level, but the kind of leadership, not just at the United Nations, but in other international agencies, is required to deliver the kind of change and working together an in-country approach that is required. And I believe very strongly a change in the balance between peacekeeping and peace building. One is simply an endless use of resources for missions that in many cases have now gone on for decades. The other could be the decisive change at the start of this century that helps us avoid that sort of commitment to peacekeeping in the future. To achieve that, I think the four things we need are, first of all, that the international multilateral agencies and those who support them, the donors, need to accept more responsibility and agree clearly who is in the lead in individual countries in post-conflict reconstruction. And I think also those who enjoy the rhetoric of independence from the developed world, and I think in that situation let down those in countries who need more help. I think more of the countries who currently resist the intervention of the United Nations need to accept their responsibility for helping their colleagues in the South out of the situation in which they find themselves. The second area is an improvement in the quality of what is actually done, not just in better coordination, but in clearer strategies built up inside the country, supported by the international community, with real accountability. Who is responsible and what will happen if they fail? Who will make sure that they are held accountable for that waste of resource and letting down the people of those individual post-conflict countries? The third is a speedier response, particularly with money being available more quickly for peace building, but also with movement of people in to help in a post-conflict situation, a far faster response from the UN and others. And fourthly, I think critically, the development of a proper system of international capacity to help build capacity inside countries, not to substitute, not to send in people from Europe or the North to substitute for the building of capacity or the development of talent in countries in the South, but the proper support for the building of capacity in country. For example, to go back to that specific of taxation and revenue and customs organisation and services. In Rwanda, they now have a national taxation and revenue authority that could organisationally compete with any, in my view, in the developed world. They did it systematically, they did it deliberately, they got help from elsewhere to achieve that, and I think if more post-conflict countries were able to do that with the right support, then more of them would find themselves in a position to be able to sustain their peace, but also sustain a growing economy and prosperity in the years to come. So I think the delivery of international capacity, particularly from neighbouring states, particularly from countries in the South to other countries in the South, but wider afield as well, delivering that in a more effective way, I think is fundamental. So those are the four specifics that I think are required. That's the context that I think we operate in. I think if we could get this right, or at least make significant improvements in it, then the phrase world without walls might mean an awful lot more outside of Europe than perhaps it does for some people in some countries today. I think it requires, as I think the last speaker said in a slightly different context, it needs organisations and agencies, it needs leaders, it needs the member states of the United Nations, it needs the officials of the international agencies to operate out with their own walls, to work with others more effectively, to do that in a way that makes a real difference. If they do that, then I genuinely believe that the young people who live in post countries, young people who have grown up, as for example in Liberia, where youngsters there grew up for 15 years without an education system, without schools to go to, youngsters who have grown up in the most horrific conditions, that those youngsters can have a future ahead of them which will not have walls, but also will not have ceilings, and will give them the opportunity to realise their potential and be all that they can be. Thank you.